Hello, everybody. Welcome to Facts on the Ground. I'm Jesse Zerwell, and I'm joined by my co-host, Misty Winston. And today we are pleased to welcome back somebody who's been on the show before, and that's Yanis Iqbal. He's an independent writer and researcher who's based in India. And last time we talked to him about Brazil. This time we're going to talk to him about Palestine. He's written extensively on that. He's written a piece recently for antiwar.com called The Ethnic Cleansing of Sheikh Jarrah, which we'll get into. And we're, as I said, pleased to have him back. So Yanis, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you for having me here.
So let's start off with what you've called the genealogy of what's happening in Palestine and go from there.
So a ceasefire was initiated on May 21 of this year, and it ended the Israeli aggressions or the intensification of Israeli aggressions in Gaza. And these attacks or massacres by the Zionist state had followed a well-described pattern. It was discernible in earlier attacks as well. So I will break down this massacre campaign into some steps so that we can get some clarity into this issue. Firstly, the Zionist state, in cooperation with the Israeli settlers, initiated a campaign of ethnic cleansing in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, Al-Bustan in Silwan. And both these neighborhoods are in East Jerusalem, to expel more than 2,000 Palestinians and expropriate their property. Secondly, Palestinians resisted. And thirdly, Israeli troops brutally cracked down on Palestinians, storming one of the holiest sites, Al-Aqsa Mosque, on one of the holiest nights, Laylatul Qadr, of the holiest month, Ramzan, in one of the holiest sites, Jerusalem, while Muslims prayed peacefully. Israeli raids continued for many days, injuring hundreds of unarmed Palestinians. Israeli attacks also occurred at the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. At the mosque, stun grenades, tear gas, and live ammunition injured Palestinian worshippers. And this was an overt attack, overt spiritual and physical attack on the Palestinian inhabitants of the city. Violence intensified on the Jerusalem Day, a nationalistic celebration of the Israeli capture of the city in 1967. And it's a really vacuous celebration because it celebrates the murder of Palestinians. And fourthly, on the asking of Palestinians, Hamas, which was democratically elected through the 2006 elections, it fired rockets at Tel Aviv. So Palestinians requested Hamas to fire the rockets, and this has not been mentioned by the Western media, which is saying that Hamas essentially provoked Israel on its own arbitrary will. And it is saying that Palestinians are also a victim of Hamas, which is not true since Palestinians do support Hamas. Hamas had earlier responded with a warning to the Israeli government. Either you end the attacks or face armed resistance. But Israel did not end its attack in Sheikh Jarrah and other areas. So on May 10, just a few days after issuing its warning, Hamas launched its rockets into Israel. Fifth, while Israel's Iron Dome system repelled most of the unguided rockets, Gaza was brutally pounded by Israel, which uses advanced technology in comparison with Gaza's really rudimentary rockets, which do not cause much harm. And Israel killed at least 243 Palestinians, including 66 children. So, and it also injured 1,900 Palestinians and displaced 90,000 residents of Gaza. Hamas, in comparison, Hamas rockets in comparison killed just 12 Israelis, including 2 children. Aerial bombardment wasn't the only defining feature of the campaign. What we witnessed was the introduction of settler violence in this Gaza attack. unlike the previous ones, in which there wasn't any large-scale participation of Israeli settlers. But this time we witnessed such participation. In Lid, for example, Jewish settlers drawn from many areas, they descended on the streets armed with guns, poles, and stones. They chanted death to Arabs. And these mobs were protected and even supplemented by the Israeli defense forces and the Israeli police when needed. And Lid was also the site where 426 Palestinians were massacred during the 1948 Nakba on the first day of the assault. So there is an essential continuity between what happened in 1948 and what is happening now.
Yeah, absolutely. And can you talk about you mentioned the unity, I believe, between Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank, and what happened what happened at Al Aqsa, which I will reiterate once more is not a compound, it's a mosque. A compound suggests that there are weapons stored there, or it's some sort of military or offensive site. But can you talk about what happened there and why it's so important to Palestinians in Gaza, what happens there as well, even though we constantly hear that there's a fracture between Gaza and the West Bank in terms of both government and the citizenry?
The attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque encapsulated what Israel has been doing elsewhere in the occupied territories or within the Israeli borders to Palestinian citizens of Israel. So Palestinians all over the occupied territories and in other regions are able to connect with what is happening elsewhere. And this is an evidence to the failure of the Israeli tactic of fragmentation. The Israeli state has deployed fragmentation as a weapon to divide the anti-colonial movement within Palestine. And this has entailed territorially dividing Palestine so that Palestinians do not have a common experience. Israel wants this, but this isn't so. Palestinians are scattered within easily controllable splinters in Gaza, East Jerusalem, West Bank, within Israel, refugee camps, and in exile across the world. And Israel hubristically felt assured that these poor Palestinians would no longer be able to resist in a collective manner. But this is belied by what is happening today also. Um, for example, when Israeli mobs supported by Israeli soldiers attacked Palestinians in Lid, Palestinians from Jerusalem and the Naqab drove there in buses to protect them by sheer number. From Lebanon and Jordan, children of Palestinian refugees who were displaced in 1948 managed to cross back into their historic lands for a temporary period. Palestinians also went on a historic general strike on May 18. um, it was widely observed by all sections of the Palestinian society, and it served as a symbol of unity and strength in the face of Israeli settler colonialism.
I wanted to ask you about the propaganda, or perhaps maybe just the narrative management that Israel is really quite adept at. But it seems to me like it's breaking down. I think that more and more people are starting to recognize. I think maybe they've taken it too far to some extent this time. But I mean, like you said, they always talk about Hamas as if it's a terrorist organization, not an elected government. They always, like Jesse always says, they always start the clock when it's convenient for them. Oh, Hamas fired a rocket at us. Now we obviously have to fight back, rather than, discussing the decades of oppression that they've had Palestinians under. Have you noticed that as well, that the narrative management that Israel's really been kind of really great at maintaining it? Do you see that also breaking down this time around? Because to me, it seems like people are far more engaged with what's happening to Palestine.
This time, Israel is losing the legitimacy war, and I think it is mainly due to social media platforms through which Palestinians have been able to amplify their voices. That is why we have been witnessing a crackdown on the digital medium itself, because Israel is realizing that it has to crack down on these digital means if it wants to regain its lost legitimacy. I don't remember exactly the statement, but Netanyahu during the attacks on Gaza had said that uh, people using Twitter can't defeat us. So that shows that he is frightened of these digitally enabled resistance movement, and that is why we saw that many meetings have been cancelled by Zoom, videos are being taken down by YouTube, and tweets are being deleted and censored by Twitter. And this is a part of a general crackdown waged by Zionism against the growing legitimacy of the Palestinian cause.
Yeah, and this is something, this control of narrative, particularly through social media, is not something new. I believe it was about 8 to 10 years ago, but don't quote me on that, that Max Blumenthal was in Jerusalem and he was interviewing random Israelis on the street about what they thought of the Obama presidency, what they thought of Palestinians in general, I believe. And they almost across the board had the most horrible things to say about Obama, of whom I'm no fan, but very, very racist things that they were certainly fine with shouting in the open. And Max posted that to YouTube and they took it down, as we're seeing these social media companies take down stuff without our permission all the time now. So that's something that's been going on for a while. But I think Misty's right that Israel is losing this legitimacy campaign that it's trying to wage through Hasbara and also narrative control through mainstream media like the New York Times, the LA Times, etc., which seem incapable of using the language that's necessary to properly describe what's going on. So there's one thing that's been going on for a while, which is not a new occurrence, but the ethnic cleansing we've been talking about is also not a new occurrence. And you start this piece off, I'm going to read the paragraph. In 1983, and this is the ethnic cleansing of Sheikh Jarrah, the piece I mentioned in the intro. In 1983, Raphael Eitan, chief of staff for the Israeli Defense Forces, IDF, said, quote, "When we have settled the land, all the Arabs will be able to do about it will be to scurry around like drugged cockroaches in a bottle," unquote. Today, we are seeing such attempts of dehumanization in Sheikh Jarrah, an area of occupied and illegally annexed East Jerusalem. Can you break down a little bit the history of this ethnic cleansing campaign that Israel's carrying out? Because even though a lot of independent media has done a good job reporting on it, it still seems like the clock has started with Sheikh Jarrah, and these evictions and house demolitions have been happening for way longer than just now.
Yes, and I think there is a sense of historical amnesia when it comes to Palestine, because we become so immersed in the current events that we forget that Israel has been doing this for decades. And let's not forget that ethnic cleansing has been foundational to the Israeli state. Recently, May 15 marked the 73rd anniversary of Nakba, which in Arabic means catastrophe. So with the example of Nakba, we can understand that how there has been a long history of Zionist violence and ethnic cleansing against Palestinians. In November 1947, the UN partitioned British-controlled Palestine, and it granted the Zionists who had been slowly colonizing the region 55% of the land, the most fertile regions, of course. And though Jews were only a third of the population and controlled only 6% of the land at the time, and this was used by the Zionist forces as a signal to wage an all-out war against Palestinians. They were given direct sanction by Britain to do this. Otherwise, they couldn't do this. Israel does all this because it is supported by imperialist powers. So in 1948, Zionist forces numbering over 50,000 launched a war to ethnically cleanse the indigenous Arab population. And that year, the year Israel was created, was thus the year in which Palestinians were dispossessed, and 750,000 Palestinians were displaced from their territories. More than 500 villages and localities were destroyed. Israel's founding hence fragmented the Palestinian people and pushed them into various territories. Those who remained in their homeland, refugees driven to join the inhabitants of Gaza, East Jerusalem, West Bank, and West Bank itself fell under military occupation in 1967, and those evicted beyond the borders of Palestine to live in refugee camps or across the world. So Palestine ceased to exist except in the hearts and minds of innumerable Palestinians who are still suffering. And Nakba was an integral part of settler colonialism. Settler colonial movements like Zionism are informed by a logic of elimination in which the indigenous population can't be allowed to live. Settler colonialism thrives on the deaths of indigenous people, and house demolitions, land confiscations, forced removal of Palestinian communities. These these actions are part of a unified settler colonial movement in which Israel wants to reduce, restrict, and ultimately destroy the Palestinian people. And Zionism is a more pure form of settler colonialism. In contrast to the Australian or American models, Zionism rigorously refuses any suggestion of native assimilation. So, Zionism constitutes a more exclusive exercise of the elimination logic than we encounter in the Australian or US examples. And what we saw in Sheikh Jarrah was this logic of elimination. Palestinians who have been living there for years, they were asked, not asked to leave, they were forcibly displaced, and they are still fighting for it. So it's another instance of what Israel has been doing for many years.
Can we actually talk about what a forced eviction looks like? Because I don't think you just kind of like corrected yourself. They were asked to, no, they weren't asked to leave. They're forcibly removed. And I think that this is something that gets lost in the mix of everything. You hear forced eviction, but nobody ever actually sees what that looks like. This is violent. This is you're violently being forced from your home, and it is just taken over by somebody who's never lived there. So can we just maybe touch on what that looks like and how what the violence looks like in these forced evictions?
The confusion over forced eviction mainly comes from the existence of an apparent judiciary, which is viewed as a neutral arbiter in the various so-called conflicts. People think that if the judiciary gives the sanction for these evictions, then everything is right, it is legal, but that is not so, because Zionist forces come and they just throw out the Palestinians. Legal orders do not matter, and even when even when the international audience has paid any attention to these illegal displacements, Israel continues with this, and this highlights the fact that this is pure force. Um, Zionism believes that Palestinians only understand the language of violence, and it treats them as such. House demolitions are another examples of illegal displacement. They follow the same pattern, because in this also the Israelis can come at any moment, whether night or morning. They come at their own will. They force the Palestinians out of their homes and destroy these houses in front of them. And there are many videos where children are crying when they see their houses being demolished. But that's a part and parcel of settler colonialism.
And at times, aren't they also often forced to demolish their own homes? Which, I mean, that's adds another level of trauma to the situation, when not only are they going to demolish your house, but they're going to make you do it yourself. Brick by brick, tear it down yourself. That's a whole other level of trauma that I can't even imagine what that does.
And we should add to the eviction point that it's not just one person per house who's being evicted. As you point out in your piece, it's 26 Palestinian families, and that's dozens of people who are going to possibly be left homeless, and not just homeless, but robbed of everything they know. And part of that being their culture or their identity, because a lot of these families have had these houses since Ottoman times, and they have the deeds to prove it. They have the keys to the front doors to prove it, but it doesn't matter. And you point this out, I think it's toward the end of your piece, this exchange between a Palestinian woman and an Israeli settler, a man. And the exchange is remarkable because he essentially says, I'm taking your home. I don't see what the problem is. And she has to try to stand there and explain to him the brutal logic or illogic of Zionist conquest. So,
well, there's the video that I saw on Twitter where there's a man standing in front of a Palestinian family saying, well, if I didn't take your house, somebody else would.
Right.
You know, right. It's this just complete, it's this entitled superiority. You know, well, if I didn't take it, somebody else would, so I might as well just take it.
Yeah. And we've seen too, and perhaps Yanis, you can speak to this, that Israel will destroy houses or steal houses no matter what it entails. We saw in the early 2000s, Rachel Corrie murdered by an American-made bulldozer as she tried to stop a home demolition in the West Bank.
Made by Caterpillar.
Right.
Boycott Caterpillar.
So can you maybe expand on essentially the limitless brutality Israel is willing to go to complete this cleansing campaign, this genocidal campaign, and also perhaps touch on the fact that while the government provides permits for house destructions, it turns away from the settlements, the illegal colonies in the West Bank that ostensibly require permits, but a lot of them don't have them, especially the ones that get closer and closer to Jordan, the border with Jordan. So can you unpack all of that? I know that's a lot.
That's a loaded question.
Yeah.
The demolitions of houses and the normalization of all these things are aided by a legal architecture. We usually forget this. We think that Israel is a democratic entity. And actually, there is a maxim that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And that is, of course, belied by what's happening now. And the laws which Israel frames, these aid and entrench the kind of colonial mentality which we saw in the video, in which that man from, I think, Brooklyn, he was so self-assured that this house belonged to him, whereas it belonged to the Palestinian. So, for example, Israel's 2018 basic law, which is also known as the nation state law, it affirms Jewish supremacy in a brazen manner. It states that Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people. The exercise of the right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. So Palestinians are denied the right to self-determination. How discriminatory is that? But we overlook this because we think that apartheid is being carried out in a secret manner by Israel, and Israel is trying to hide this. No, this is not true. Israel is trying to affirm this apartheid. And that is why Israelis are also self-assured that they can steal, demolish houses, kill and murder Palestinians. So that explains the kind of mentality which we are witnessing now.
That's actually a really good point, because they're not really trying to hide it. They're doing all of this out in the open. I mean, they're committing literal war crimes on camera, because I think that's because you're right. They do have this entitlement where they've been allowed and enabled by, you know, Western powers to get away with this stuff for decades. And so there really is no accountability. They have nothing to fear, at least up until this point. Like I said before, I think that the house of cards is starting to fall down. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. They're really not, they're not trying to do this in secret. They're really just doing it out loud and in the open.
Right. Go ahead.
Israeli state understands that the colonized population can only be subjugated when fear is used openly. Fear cannot be but generated through lawlessness. Colonial power is sought in the absolutist and abject use of force without any norms, without any restrictions. Normlessness is the way colonialism actualizes itself in various regions, in South Africa, for instance. And Israel knows that Palestinians should comprehend that this state of lawlessness is not an exception, but is the only way Israel knows how to govern. In other words, the colonizer doesn't seek legitimacy. It wants the Palestinians to understand that you do not constitute a human group. You are subhuman, undeserving of any dignity. And for that, you need to use open and pure force.
Right. And we see, which isn't talked about much anymore, if it ever was, the way Israel prevents what's called the backdoor right of return. So if you're a Palestinian who lives in Gaza or the West Bank and you marry a Palestinian citizen of Israel, you're not allowed to go live with them in Israel. And that's intentionally done to prevent Palestinians from exercising their right of return and thereby offsetting the Jewish majority and thereby delegitimizing the claims to it being a Jewish state, much less a democracy. And again, that doesn't get mentioned enough, but that's, I think, a very central part of this ethnic cleansing, this genocidal campaign. But Misty brought up a good point that this is enabled by several entities, the US being the main one, the Gulf states, which is more of a recent development. Perhaps we can talk about that. But then there's also the UN, which almost unanimously votes to at least condemn Israel each time it perpetuates its genocide against Palestinians. And the US and Israel, and there's one other island country that's quite small, I can't remember the name, but they reflexively vote to object to even a condemnation of what Israel is doing to Palestinians. And then if there is any talk of moving forward, it's a negotiation about having more negotiations, and the can, as you will, gets kicked down the road. So can you talk about these enablers?
The enablers are mainly the imperialist powers. And by using the recent event as an example, we can understand how these powers foster a kind of culture of inaction in the face of the Zionist attacks. Um, Major powers, as usual, played their traditional role. The US unequivocally lent support to Israel, first abetting the settler state in the destruction of Gaza, and then coming forward to announce its intention to rebuild the besieged territory in an unsurprising expression of hypocrisy and hubris. The UN condemned the hapless situation, called for calm, but did not do anything meaningful to ensure that it won't be repeated in the near future. And European Union, we ignore the existence of this entity. The European Union expressed concerns, paying lip service to Palestinians. It preserved the brutal rule of aiding Israel's settler colonialism, and the organization's key players, such as Germany, they fund military occupation, they assist colonialism, and naturalize apartheid. All the important actors proved incapable of upholding international law and holding Israel accountable for the continuous violation of these laws. And the UN Security Council, its legitimacy eroded further as it was uh, paralyzed essentially. It did not do anything in the face of the Israeli attacks. And what explains this terrible passivity is imperialism. It has been the main factor accounting for the sheer absence of any meaningful support for Palestine. The EU and USA don't raise eyebrows over the unquestionably brutal policies of Israel because they benefit from the presence of a Middle Eastern state which remains incontestably committed to imperialist narratives and imperatives. The Palestinian people's democratic goals and their commitment to end Israeli racism are values that Western governments refuse to share. the values these governments share with Israel, contrary to their false claims, are not democracy and freedom, but rather the outright suppression of non-white and indigenous people. So there is also an ideological affinity between Israel and the Euro-Atlantic powers. And this ideological affinity has shown itself in the various functions Israel has performed since its violent establishment in 1948. It served as a bulwark against Soviet influence. It defeated the nationalist tide headed by Gamal Abdul Nasser, and it has served as a pathway for channeling arms to unpopular regimes. It is a regional backer of oil rich Gulf monarchies, a house for US weaponry, a major partner and market for the US military industrial complex. So, why will USA end support for Israel? It benefits from its existence in so many ways, and Biden himself acknowledged this. He said that investment in Israel is one of the most fruitful investments US makes. So that underlines the necessity of Israel for USA. And USA has provided arms, and EU plays a silent role. It says that it supports the two-state solution, but it does nothing. It allows reconstruction efforts, but then also allows Israel to destroy the buildings and whatever have been built with the funds. This is pure hypocrisy. It has subsidized colonialism as well. A quarter of Israel's military export goes to European countries. And Europe is Israel's largest trade partner, absorbing one third of Israel's exports. And these include products made in the settlements. So this means that nothing can be done as long as we do not tackle imperialism also. The Palestinian struggle has to be anti-imperialist, and Palestinians have already understood this.
And it's a global fight against imperialism, I think. And you're absolutely right. Joe Biden, in fact, said if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. It's a geopolitical pawn. It's just a way to maintain control in the region. But I think what's been so effective in, maintaining the ability to enable Israel is, again, the propaganda. In the West, we don't hear the truth about Palestine. We don't hear the truth about much of anything, but we definitely don't hear the truth about Palestine, especially through our mainstream media. And even now, as things are starting to come out more and more, we have people like Mark Ruffalo, who claims to be a Palestinian supporter and an activist, who, walked back a very true statement for no other reason that he was pressured to do so. You have Bernie Sanders refusing to call it what it is. And these are supposed to be like progressive, left-leaning people. And that's been something that's been that environment has been manufactured in the West. Specifically in the United States. You're not allowed to criticize Israel. They're very good at using anti-Semitism as a weapon. They will call you anti-Semitic to get you to stop the criticism of Israel. But I think that, as we mentioned earlier, that is losing its effectiveness. People are starting to see through it. And so I think that, we're going to see an even bigger crackdown on social media and on Palestinian voices. We mentioned earlier that they're being, I think Instagram is probably the worst right now. They're completely censoring Palestinian voices, but it's across all platforms, and that's only going to continue to get worse, not just in as far as Israel-Palestine goes, but across all issues. The censorship is going to continue to crack down. That's how they maintain control. They recognize that they're losing it, and that's, something that people really need to be mindful of.
Yeah, and just to add to that point, on the American side, I don't know if either of you has read about this. It popped up on my radar yesterday, but now there are apparently what are called sedition hunters in the US who
That sounds great.
who are completely independent, citizen-based cyber sleuths, if you will, who are trying to track down those responsible for what happened at the Capitol, or those who were not responsible, even those who were there on January 6th of this year. And it seems like a tactic right out of the Israeli playbook. So
Twitter has a new thing called Birdwatch, where you can go and narc on people for saying things that you don't agree with. Doesn't matter if it's true or not, but you know.
And then if you look at the lineage of the word sedition, it goes back, you can go back farther than this, but I believe it's the 1918 Alien and Sedition Act that was passed under Wilson, if I'm not mistaken, Woodrow Wilson. And I recommend everybody check that out. There's an abridged version you can read if you search for it. And it essentially outlines what these people are doing, except they're not doing it under the professional or official guise of the government. They're doing it on their own, and they're being encouraged by the government. And this is sort of what we see with the Hasbara trolls. Everybody wants to talk about Russian trolls. The Hasbara trolls and bots are and have been around for a long time, and I think much more expansive in their work. So perhaps you can talk about that a little bit, expand a little more on the propaganda efforts that we talked about earlier, because it seems like a colleague of ours says the US is the most propagandized country in the world. And I think that's true, but a lot of that trickles over from Israel. And then a lot of what we do here trickles back over there. I would say even more than trickles, but perhaps you can expand on that.
The propaganda efforts deployed by Israel to legitimize its brutal acts are massive. It even created a ministry to direct and organize these efforts. And it also launched an Israeli cyber unit in 2015 to just remove digital content which it does not like. So this underlines the fact that Israel is deploying ever greater amounts of money in propaganda efforts to justify what it is doing. And the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, it was established in 2015 to counter the downward trend in Israel's war of legitimacy. It was a ministry essentially dedicated to ideological warfare against Palestinians. The ministry engaged in an extremely well organized operation targeting all those groups that are critical of Zionism. In 2016, the Israeli Minister of Strategic Affairs said that he was going to establish a dirty tricks unit to establish, hire, and tempt non-profit organizations not associated with Israel to disseminate negative information about BDS. So even officials of Israel are saying that they are waging a legitimacy war, and they are doing this so that they can hide or legitimize what they are doing. And the MSA, the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, it developed a program that organizes trolls whose aim is to either slander Palestinians or virulently clamor for the deletion of their digital content. And this program was preceded by another one, a trolling group started by the Interdisciplinary Center, IDC, and the Israeli American Council, which is an American NGO backed by the now dead Zionist donor Sheldon Adelson. And it was tested during Israel's 2012 and 2014 attacks on Gaza, which, as we know, resulted in thousands of civilian deaths. And this program was organized to coordinate groups of trolls who could propagate content that falsely maligns Palestinians. And today, this online platform or group includes 15,000 active members and has offices in 3 countries. So that is the nature of the Israeli propaganda being deployed.
Perhaps if we could also talk about the attacks on journalists and news media. That was something that was, widely shown across platforms, that they were bombing media buildings, they were arresting and beating journalists. That seems to have definitely been heightened. There's always been attacks on journalists and journalism, across the globe, really. Powerful people don't want their secrets exposed, obviously. But I think that is something that we also see mirrored in the United States. We're seeing that across both countries. And it really is another one of those like grasps for control or maintaining control of the narrative. Can you talk a little bit about the attacks that we saw recently on the media and on, like the Al Jazeera building and all of that stuff?
Recently, on June 6, Israeli occupation forces detained Palestinian activist and journalist Munna al-Kurd. She is an eloquent activist, and she expresses her opinion in an extremely beautiful manner. And she's forthright. And her brother also, he was also hunted, and he too is a journalist and writer based in Palestine. And they both have been highlighting the ethnic cleansing of Sheikh Jarrah. A day before the arrest of the Al Kurd family, Al Jazeera Arabic journalist was arrested by Israeli police while covering a demonstration in Sheikh Jarrah also. She was later released from custody. And this basically outlines the myth of democracy, which we uncritically accept, because Israel violates free speech in an extremely substantive manner. For example, the boycott law, it disallows Israelis to publish a public call for a boycott against the state of Israel. And this also has consequences for journalism, because journalism then becomes a fraught territory in which you can be incarcerated, you can be caught in a legal dispute on publishing any content which the Zionist state deems as unacceptable. And this is an organized campaign. It is being waged by the Zionist state itself. Um, and I think we are not seeing this war on journalists at such a high level, except in Israel. In India, maybe it is such because the government we have right now, it is also using the sedition law, which it inherited from the colonial era, to slap journalists with false allegations and to incarcerate them. So as you said, this is a global trend, and it has different levels in different countries.
And just speaking of the sedition law, I just want to read this text to expand on that. And this is from a website, law.jrank.org, which, as I said, if you Google or look up the Alien and Sedition Act, is one of the first better entries that comes up. It says an amendment to the Espionage Act of 1917, the Sedition Act of 1918, made it a felony, 1, to convey false statements interfering with American war efforts, 2, to willfully employ, quote, disloyal, profane, scurrilous, or abusive language, unquote, about the U.S. form of government, the Constitution, the flag, or U.S. military or naval forces. 3, to urge the curtailed production of necessary war materials. Or 4, to advocate, teach, defend, or suggest the doing of any such acts. Violations were punishable by fine, imprisonment, or both. The law was aimed at curbing political dissent expressed by socialists, anarchists, pacifists, and certain labor leaders. And I would add journalists to that, but it's a bit reminiscent of, or more than reminiscent of, what we've been talking about with regard to narrative control and clamping down on what can and cannot be said. And it's almost the exact same sort of crackdown, or hints at the exact same sort of crackdown that we're seeing in Palestine against journalists. And I want to bring up this one case because I think it's important to keep bringing attention to. And it's that of Issa Amro, who's a Palestinian human rights worker in the West Bank. And we talked to Miko Peled about him because he's been very involved in Issa's case, because the Israelis are basically trying to put him in prison for protecting kids walking to school down Shuhada Street in Hebron. So yes, there's an attack against journalists, but even people who are trying to do human rights work, who are not involved in acts of resistance, although I don't think there's anything wrong with those, even human rights workers are being attacked to the point where they're facing imprisonment in what we all know are horrendous Israeli prisons. So that's just something to expand upon on the journalist point. But if we could just backtrack a tiny bit to the enablement, you mentioned the EU, One country that never gets mentioned much at all is Egypt and their control of the Rafah crossing in Gaza and their willingness to work with Israel to keep the siege of Gaza going. So can you talk a little bit about Egypt's role in this? Because it's something that I've found a lot of people aren't aware of, and understandably, because we rarely hear about it.
I recently attended a Palestine solidarity webinar in which Sandeep Pandey, he's an Indian activist based in Lucknow, an Indian city, and he went to Gaza a few years back to um, send humanitarian goods to the people living there. And he went there as part of a delegate or group of people, and they were warmly welcomed throughout many regions. And they traveled a lot. They went to Iran, they went to Syria, and many other countries where they were warmly received. But when they approached Gaza, Egyptian officials are there. So when they asked them to, when they asked the Egyptian officials to let them in, they said that we want some bribe, and the bribe was $6,000 just to go there. And then when they went inside Gaza, they wanted to transport the humanitarian goods, and then again the Egyptian officials came and they demanded a bribe of $20,000. They couldn't give them such a huge amount, so they amassed, I think, 15,000. So that underlines that Egypt and many other Arab states also are backing Israel, and this was made visible and public in the normalization agreements of 2020. So Egypt is playing an extremely sordid role. It is manipulating Palestinians, and this is an this is an extreme downfall from its role in the 1960s and 50s as a leader of the liberation struggle, though it was imperfect in that also.
What do you think? What's your theory on what lies behind these normalization efforts? What are the Arab states thinking? We know these are so-called kingdoms, monarchies, and the people are not getting to make the decisions. But what motives or motive even do you think lies behind these normalization efforts?
I think one motive is Trump's. It was mainly a domestic motive to shore up support among his own electorate, and another motive may be a really desperate attempt to fracture Palestinian steadfastness. This may sound absurd, but Israel too is desperate because it was created, a colonial state was created when decolonization was being initiated. When British colonialism ended in India, colonialism started in Palestine. So Israel was born in an extremely hostile conjuncture in which the third world was waging national liberation struggles to free itself from the colonial powers. So I think Israel uh, organized these normalization agreements to demoralize Palestinians and to convince them that they had no hope left. But it couldn't do so. And I think that these normalization agreements may prove to be counterproductive because Palestinians have now realized that Arab unity is just false. In the context of the Israeli Palestine issue, the Arab world has played a really Janus faced role. It has sometimes aided the Palestinian struggle, but it has also tried to constrict and regulate it to its own benefits. And this realization of the failure of the Arab governments may force the Palestinians to review their strategy. And they may come up with more innovative options to end the Israeli occupation. And we are already seeing that they're trying to bridge their internal differences to forge a common front against Israel, because reliance on Arab monarchies and countries has not brought them any benefit since the Camp David Accord. And we can see the emergence of the 1960s movement, dealing with Israel and the international community on their own and fighting for their rights without any over reliance on the Arab countries.
Right. And we saw campaigns by the PFLP, for example, and Layla Khaled, who was involved in hijacking a plane. And a lot of people look at that and say, why would anybody do that? And that begs the question, what is making people so desperate that they feel like they have to hijack a plane just to draw attention to what's happening to them, not even to find a resolution, but just to say to the world, hey, this is happening. And this was back in the 70s, and obviously things have gotten worse since then. But that reaction, that desperate reaction is, although I know Layla Khaled is quite a measured woman and is not impulsive, but that sort of desperate reaction is always framed as terrorism, as we were talking about earlier with regard to the Hamas rockets. And you mentioned that Palestinians asked Hamas to fire these rockets in self-defense and resistance. Can you just expand on what you mean by Palestinians asking them to do that?
Palestinians asked them to do this because they live in a situation of desperation. Death has permeated every pore of their existence, and they aren't able to do anything peaceful because Israel has promoted a deliberate form of depoliticization. It has incarcerated, it has assaulted secular nationalist leaders who approach the Palestinian issue with a political mindset. Israel doesn't want a political resolution to this issue because um, that will entail a smooth end to the Israeli occupation. And with the armed resistance, Israel has the possibility of tackling the Palestinians because it is a technologically armed, US supported state which has all the resources uh, it can use to suppress the Palestinian movement. And that's why I think, due to the depoliticization promoted by Israel, Palestinians were left with no other option than to ask Hamas to fire rockets at Tel Aviv.
I'm just curious how that request was, what encompassed that request. Was it a collection of many Palestinians who put pressure on Hamas to do something, or was it a more informal request than that? I'm just curious how they asked them, as you say.
Electronic Intifada reported that Hamas leaders were receiving many messages on their phones asking them to fire rockets at Tel Aviv. So that was the mode of doing that, I think.
Yeah, and we should be clear too that Israel's military headquarters is located essentially in the center of Tel Aviv. And what often gets misreported or just omitted completely is that, yes, Hamas, just like Hezbollah, has to rely on these essentially homemade rockets, these faulty rockets, but it's all they have to resist. And under UN Resolution 242, they have the right to resist their occupation by any means necessary, including using these rockets. But again, it's always framed as them making the first aggressive move. And it's always left out that Israel purposely plants its military installations among civilian populations so that it can constantly make the claim that these rockets, which, as we've discussed, aren't precision guided, as Israel claims all its weapons are, Hamas isn't just firing them willy-nilly, just like Hezbollah wasn't firing them willy-nilly in 2006. They're trying to target these military installations, but it gets to a point, and this was toward when the ceasefire, if you want to call it that, was brokered, which was really just Israel giving up. Hamas made a threat to Israel, which essentially caused them to back off, to run away, as they did. Can you talk about that?
Can you re-specify your question, because I couldn't
Sure.
understand?
So I'm sure you remember that Hamas was firing rockets and Israel was retaliating, as it always does, from the air. And Hamas essentially called in a threat to Tel Aviv and said, if this continues, we're going to rain down, I think it was something like 20,000 rockets, somewhere up there. And that was one of the catalysts for forcing Israel to back off of what it was doing, to essentially run away from what it was doing because it was losing.
I don't know that the combative capacity of Hamas is expanded or what, because I have read in news reports, but Grey Zone reported to the contrary. I have read in news reports that Hamas hasn't substantially upgraded its military capacities, and Israel still enjoys military superiority. So I thought that Hamas rockets pose no threat to Israel, and Israel stopped its campaign, I think, mainly because it was losing legitimacy. And within the US, the American citizenry were also opposing the Israeli attacks. So it may also be related to this, because US gives sanction to Israel to start its attacks. And whenever US support ends, Israel also ends its attacks. So I think it is much more related to the loss of legitimacy rather than an increase in Hamas's military capacity.
I would definitely agree with that. I think that Israel very quickly realized that they were not looking good. And I think that they're very unused to that because they're used to maintaining, such a level of control over the narrative. And I think that they're realizing now that they're losing that. I'm curious though, how much of this latest attack do you think was politically motivated? Benjamin Netanyahu is very under pressure right now. He wants to maintain his position of power. He's very close to being ousted. And we all know that if a leader is in trouble, you start a war, your approval ratings go up, which is very depressing that's what, humanity, how humanity operates, that, somebody's approval rating goes up when they go to war. But do you think that there was a level of political motivation from Benjamin Netanyahu on this latest attack?
The cycle of terrorism that Israel started was, I think, politically motivated. Ramzi Baroud, a well-known Palestinian scholar, he said that the ethnic
I've met
cleansing
him before, actually. Very, very nice man.
He said that the ethnic cleansing of Sheikh Jarrah started because Netanyahu wanted to shore up support. And we know that this ethnic cleansing led to the current scenario. So it was politically motivated. And once Netanyahu started this chain, he couldn't back off. It would seem that he's timid. So he escalated this attack, and we are left with the present day situation.
So going back to Resolution 242 and sort of UN enablement, it's constantly referred to as the only solution, the two-state solution, which if you look at the West Bank, the fragmentation of it, especially if you look at Area C, which is a huge swath of settler colonial takeover, it makes no sense that there could be a so-called contiguous or viable Palestinian state, and that a two-state solution has been completely demolished by Israeli colonialism. I'm wondering if you can talk about that and if you agree with the one-state solution, because it seems like that's the only game in town anymore, along with BDS to get there.
Israel has demolished the two-state solution because the astronomical increase in illegal Israeli settlements, these have resulted in a non-contiguous and an essentially non-sovereign entity. And a two-state solution would mean that Palestinians would live in an extremely fragmented territory without any contiguous areas. And I think this is also a result of the Oslo Accords, which divided the Palestinian territories into Area A, Area B, and Area C, each with varying levels of Palestinian autonomy. And this fragmentation was solidified and accelerated by Israel when it left no distinctions between these three areas and just asserted its own sovereignty in a violent manner over all of Palestinian territory. So, two-state solution is dead now. What we need is a one-state democratic solution, and we are seeing a reassertion of this solution nowadays in major newspapers. In India also, like the Hindu, it's a major newspaper, and it is also advocating for one state solution. According to me, this is a major shift in the Overton window, because now the legitimacy of one state solution is increasing.
I agree. And I think we're seeing the more astute observers and analysts of what's happening in Palestine realize that Noam Chomsky can't seem to bring himself to realize that.
Oh, Noam Chomsky
but,
needs to stop talking.
And I only bring that up not to rag on Chomsky, but just because he has such an influential voice and he's been right on a lot of other things. So
he just praised Joe Biden. I just can't with
did he
him
really?
anymore. He did. And it's not good. He needs to stop talking, please.
Then I take back all I said.
Yes.
No, not really, but
no, yeah, listen, Noam Chomsky, he was hugely influential in my personal radicalization. He's done great work. That's not to be discounted. But he is not without his flaws. We'll say that.
Right. And he's always taken the two-state solution point of view. And if you watch the documentary that was made about him, Manufacturing Consent, which is the title of his well-known book, in the beginning, he talks about growing up, and he talks about Arab Zionist binationalism and cooperation, which just seems like a total myth to me. And I'm wondering what you think about that, Yanis, because it's something that's put forward by these elite intellectuals who do have mostly a good track record. But again, as I said, because they have such an influential platform, people hear that and they think, okay, well, the two-state solution is the only solution, without realizing, no pun intended, the facts on the ground.
I think Noam Chomsky supports the two-state solution because he understates the significance of colonialism. I follow Franz Fanon when it comes to understanding colonialism. He said that colonialism necessitates a clear division of the territories into the colonizer and colonized. There can be no cooperation and no any sympathy or anything between the colonized and the colonizer as long as this structure of occupation exists. So as long as Zionism exists, there can be no cooperation between Palestinians and the Israelis, because it denies the humanity of Palestinians. So all talk or all discourse about binationalism is false, because colonialism is the entrenchment of Manichaeanism, where two worlds exist simultaneously. And Oslo Accords made a mistake when it ignored colonialism and followed Chomsky's advice, giving a really technical view of what is happening in Israel, Palestine, supposing that Palestine and Israel are equal entities, not asymmetric entities in which one is colonizer and one is colonized.
Right. And during Oslo, we saw too another glaring example of how dishonest an actor Israel is. As Israel was supposedly negotiating for peace, Rabin was having more illegal colonies built in the West Bank, increasing it, I think, to its highest point at that point in the early 90s. And then we also saw at the same time, the massacre at I believe it was at the Al Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron. Baruch Goldstein, I believe was his name, was the individual who came in with something like an assault rifle and massacred close to 20 people, maybe even more. So, and this was all happening under the guise of peace negotiations. And then fast forward to Camp David in 2000 with Clinton and Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat. It seemed to be all nice and rosy on the surface, but Arafat had to walk away from it because he was offered a deal, if you will, that if he accepted, Palestinians were essentially going to revolt, because it was, I forget the exact number. Jonathan Cook, the journalist, has been really good about breaking these numbers down, but it was a pathetic amount of historic Palestine that they were being offered. And, Israel says it wants peace, but all actions point to the contrary. So who even knows if they got that little amount and could make a statelet out of it, that Israel would stop trying to erase them. And erasure is something you hit on in your piece toward the end. And I'm wondering if you can expand upon that. I know we've talked about it a little bit, or we've broached it with the fragmentation method, but what Israel seeks to do eventually is erase the Palestinians completely.
Yes, Zionist settler colonialism has two objectives. It is annihilation and annexation, and erasure is basically annihilation, in which you want to eliminate Palestinians. And I wrote in the article that in the present day period, it is being done through digital means, because this means that you will silence the Palestinians and in this way create the conditions for their erasure. Because as long as attention is being drawn to what is happening in Palestine, no erasure can be carried on. So, first, you have to put the lid on what is happening on Palestine, conceal it from the world so that you can carry on with your erasure. And here I would like to talk about Laila Khalid, because she was recently censored also. In 2020, um, tech giants intervened to censor a San Francisco State University online event in which Khalid was participating. Event was first cancelled by Zoom, and which cited concerns with Khalid's affiliation with the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, which is hypocritically designated a terrorist organization by the US. And following Zoom's decision, the university streamed the event on Facebook and YouTube, both of which took their cue from Zoom and removed footage from their respective platforms. So, this emphasizes the growing importance of social media and its link with erasure. In the foreseeable future, erasure will happen through social media, and it will enable real annihilation at the material ground, at the concrete reality, in which Palestinians will be killed and their killings will be silenced and smothered through these social media giants.
100%.
Yeah, and we see that happening, not to wear out the term, but across the board, especially to Palestinians and other colonized people.
It's
But
really to anybody who speaks against the empire, the agenda of
right,
empire.
right. I just think that it's more, well, it's not good for anybody. I really don't want to like morally make a moral equivalence argument between which one is worse and which one isn't, because it's bad across the board.
It is bad across the board because it really does. It just affects all of us.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yes, while it is more directly, it more directly affects Palestinians, really it affects all of us. The censorship and the narrative management. I mean, Jesse knows this is kind of my thing. This is what I'm obsessed with. But narrative management is 100% the front line of everything. That's where our fight is, because we cannot effectively fight for anything that we care about if we don't have the ability to discuss it, to spread information, to have conversations, and to not be force-fed propaganda. So, I mean, that really is it's a huge deal that I wish more people would grasp.
Yeah, and there's also, because of the Israel lobby's reach within the US, there's a fear of even the remotest criticism of Israel. And we certainly see this in the mainstream media, when every mainstream so-called correspondent is on a hill in Jerusalem as Gaza is obliterated in the background, reporting like they're neutral. Yeah, like they're there and that they're neutral. Yeah. And I don't know if it's still the case, but it was up until very recently, if it's not anymore. The New York Times Jerusalem bureau is actually stationed in a house that was stolen from a Palestinian family. So
seriously, I didn't know that.
yeah. So
that's perfect, really. I mean, that's like the perfect example.
yeah, it's almost the perfect symbiosis of colonization and erasure, as you say, Yanis, and what ultimately amounts to genocide. So to wrap up, there are efforts being made by both Palestinians and people elsewhere in the world to combat this in nonviolent ways. For example, the BDS movement, which American politicians just see as anathema and untouchable.
Third rail.
But a lot of people forget that BDS was started by, it's a civil society resistance movement that was started by Palestinians. It wasn't something suggested or imposed on them from the outside, from Westerners. And that gets obfuscated all the time. And the most American politicians are willing to say about it, if they have support for it, if they really have support for it, is that, oh, well, it's a free speech issue. It doesn't have anything to do with the human rights or liberation of Palestinians. It's a free speech issue. People should be able to say whatever they want. The Palestinian thing, that's another problem. We'll take care of that with more negotiations. So there is BDS, though. I think it's becoming more and more effective. People are waking up to the fact, or realizing the fact that they don't want to provide or finance occupation and genocide. So I don't think that BDS is in trouble, but I do think it's a good way forward to try to end what's happening. We saw it work in South Africa, although the dynamics there were slightly different. And then also on the nonviolent response tip, there was the Great March of Return. And Norman Finkelstein made a good point at that time when Palestinian civilians were being sniper shot by IDF snipers who were hiding behind huge dirt mounds. I mean, you can go online and find this footage or pictures of it anywhere. And their orders were coming directly from the top as to whom to shoot. So they knew every single person they were targeting. Anyway, that was a completely peaceful protest on the part of the Palestinians. And I know some of them tried to breach the fence to actually carry out a return into Palestine. And we saw a lot of them get killed because of that. So all that time, and even before that, we've been hearing from commentators like Nicholas Kristof, just these milquetoast commentators who think like everything's going to be okay eventually. We're going to find peace, which I hope is the case, but I'm not as naive as he is. They say, where's the Palestinian Gandhi? Where's the Palestinian movement that's not going to embrace violence, but is going to resist its occupation nonviolently, which in and of itself doesn't make sense. But here you have two examples, BDS and the Great March of Return. And what does Israel do? It shuts the first one down, especially in terms of social media and equating it with anti-Semitism. And then it took the Great March of Return and made it seem like it was not a civil society organized event, but Hamas had organized it, and it was encouraging families to bring their children there to put them at risk. And it was, remember the kites that Palestinians were flying over the fence, the flaming kites, and then Israel made a big deal about them and started calling them arson kites. They were also burning the tires so that they could have some sort of barrier, visual barrier between them and the snipers. And there was actually one point where an Israeli drone fired on a pile of burning tires to put it out. So my question after that long-winded analysis is, if these nonviolent solutions, because they really could be solutions, if they're being stomped on as hard as they can, and at the same time there are these claims and whines being made by the international community that Palestinians don't know how to resist, or they should resist a certain way, what's there to be done? What resort do Palestinians have, and those who support their liberation, if we can't, if these efforts keep getting scuppered? I'm just curious what your, as we wrap up, what your position is on that, and what we could possibly do going forward. Did you freeze up? Yanis?
Looks like he froze.
Okay.
Mm.
Can wait.
Oh,
I think he's going to try to reconnect. This is what happened yesterday. Hello.
Yes, I heard your question. I can answer it now.
Okay. Did you get all of it, or do you want me to?
Yes, I got all of it.
Okay.
I think we have hope only in non-violent resistance, because the era of revolutionary violence was the 1960s and 50s, when the third world grouped as a cohesive bloc to support decolonization movements. And it is extremely imperative that we support the BDS now, because it represents an extremely effective manner to counter Israeli colonialism, because Palestinians can't wage a um, a mass movement within their territories. Liberals say that Palestinians should wage a peaceful Gandhian mass agitation. It's not possible. Uh, Israelis, so the Israeli state has itself killed the possibility of any such movement by imprisoning leaders, by killing protesters, and by doing all sorts of tactics which involve violence. So BDS is the only hope, and BDS is being targeted in USA particularly. In September 2020, the US State Department committed to target, fight, and kill the BDS movement, and these are the State Department's own words. The BDS movement was conceived in 2005, and it seeks to exert pressure on Israel to finally end its brutal occupation and to recognize the right of return for displaced Palestinian refugees. And it is a call for consumers to boycott Israeli goods and producers to divest from Israel, and sanctions to be levied on the government of Israel in response to the violence inflicted by the colonialists. And the campaign has been effective. That is why it is being labeled racist, anti-Semitic, and whatnot. So my suggestion is that we lend wholehearted support to the BDS to support the Palestinian National Liberation Movement.
I agree. And I also agree with you on the point regarding violent resistance, not only because under law, not only because it's legal, but as you said, what other choice do Palestinians have now? Yes, there's BDS, and that's important, and we need to keep that alive and strengthen it. But when it comes to Israeli bombardment, BDS is worthless in a sense, because the atrocity is already happening. And I agree with what I believe he's a Lebanese journalist, or at least he's based in Beirut. I think his name is Laith Marouf. He was just interviewed on Red Lines with Anya Parampil, but he said, I'm not a member of Hamas. I don't stand by them politically. I'm not affiliated with them. But when the Israeli apartheid state is attacking extremely disproportionately, I mean, there's no proportion there whatsoever, Palestinians, especially those imprisoned in the Gaza ghetto, that he supports the firing of rockets into Israel. And I think that's important to support if you really care about Palestinian liberation, because it's not about hoping that Israelis or Jews get hurt, or even Palestinian citizens of Israel. It's about, this is all we have, and that's what the world needs to understand. That's how desperate the situation is. And we keep seeing it over and over. But again, it comes back to the narrative control of, these are terrorist acts that weren't provoked by anything. It's just Hamas has a fetish for shooting rockets into Israel every now and then. But I think that's a good place to wrap up. And as you made the point, we need to focus on BDS and keep pushing that, and also support any other nonviolent means of resistance, but also realize that and accept that what Hamas does and other resistance factions within Gaza, especially, are legitimate and necessary, and not to be slandered as terrorism. And
I think it's important too to boost Palestinian voices whenever possible.
Exactly.
They are getting censored across all social media platforms. So whenever you have the opportunity to share one of their posts, do so. It's very helpful.
Yeah. And yeah, there's so many things I could ask you about. I've made notes here, but I think that's a good place to wrap up. And we kind of got to the heart of what's been happening lately, but it would be excellent to have you back on to discuss this further as it develops, because I think it's going to, Israel always has something up its sleeve with regard to continuing its campaign of genocide.
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens with Netanyahu and whether or not he maintains power.
Right.
So that'll definitely be, it's not like the person who is potentially taking over. He's arguably worse. So we'll see.
Yeah. Eilert Shockett, I believe. That's
and
who
Bennett.
It is. I'm sorry. Naftali Bennett. Yeah. Yeah. They're arguably more right-wing than Netanyahu has been.
Yes. So yeah, we would definitely love to have you back on to talk about this as it moves forward.
All right. So Yanis, thanks again for joining us. Our guest today on Facts on the Ground has been Yanis Iqbal. He's an independent writer and researcher who's based in India. We'll link to his piece that we discussed today on antiwar.com. And I highly suggest that you follow his work. He's written for numerous publications about numerous geopolitical topics, if you will. And are you on Twitter? Is there anywhere anybody can find you online?
I'm on Facebook, not on Twitter.
Sorry?
I'm on Facebook, and I can give you the link to my Facebook profile.
Sure. If you just want to email that, that's fine. So we'll link to a bunch of your pieces and where people can find you. And we can put your email out too, if that's okay with you. I'm not sure.
Yes, that's okay with me.
Okay. Yeah, just so that people can reach you if they're interested in a similar conversation or another one. So Yanis, thank you so much again for joining us. And we look forward to talking to you again.
Thank you. It was a pleasure discussing with you.
Thank you.